Hi everybody, so today we're going to be looking at drawing and painting buildings, and I'm going to be sharing some of my top tips. I really love painting buildings. I think they can have so much personality and character to them. So I'm going to share my top tips for dealing with the kind of practical problems. How do you do windows? How do you do doors? How do you do perspective? How do you simplify details when you're painting lots of buildings or a very big building, that kind of thing. But I'm also going to share some tips for kind of bringing personality to the buildings that you're painting. So first thing is sketching. If I was sketching a piece like this straight into my sketchbook, I would probably use a pencil that is sympathetic to the colour of the building so that I don't get dark lines showing through. So for something like this, I would have used probably this pencil, which is Venetian red. But for my demo sketching, I'm just going to use a regular pencil and some printer paper just so you can see it nice and clearly. So when I'm sketching a building, I always want to do the outside of the building first and then put the windows and doors in. It's a bit like drawing a face. You wouldn't do the eyes and the nose and mouth and then draw an oval around them afterwards. You would do the oval for the face first and then work out where the eyes and nose and mouth go. And it's the same with buildings. I draw the outside first and then put in the doors and the windows and the details. Something that I find helps me draw straight lines, and I'm not good at drawing straight lines at all. So if you think, I can't draw buildings because I can't do straight lines and things being neat and precise, me neither. I can't draw a straight line to save my life. It's fine. Wonky buildings are great. They've got loads of personality. But something that helps make my lines a little bit neater, I find, is holding the pencil like this and kind of sliding my hand across. Like, that's a reasonably straight line for me, working like that, rather than if I was holding the pencil very upright, holding it right at the end and gripping it hard like this would be, for me, harder to get a nice straight line. This was quite a nice smooth kind of flow, just holding it like that. So it's worth playing around with how you hold your pencil to help you get nice smooth lines when you're sketching. So we've got the outline of the building, and if I was sketching something like the house I just saw, I'd think, okay, maybe we've got a bit of detail for the roof. And you can see how this technique really does make it easier for getting nice lines. And then you need to think about proportions and where everything fits together. So this house was a kind of a funny one because we only have windows on one side. So if I kind of divide it roughly in half, and then think we have to have a door about here, and then always just kind of looking at little sort of checkpoints and just making sure everything's balanced. So for example, is the top of the window level with the top of the door? It usually is, particularly in Victorian buildings, or is maybe the top of the windows lower than the door. So have a look and check where they are in relation to each other. Any kind of little architectural details. And then the window kind of comes down to this sort of painted bit here. And then I've got to fit in another 2 windows. So I'm just going to put these in really lightly, and then I can adjust if I've run out of space, which I have a bit. So now that I've seen, okay, I've run out of space, I can just bring this one down much more. And get it so I'm happy with it. So it's really good at this point with sketching just to take a step back and just do some really basic checks. And it sounds so obvious, but I get caught out by this, which is, are the windows that need to be the same size, are they roughly the same size? Do they have roughly the same distance between them? Are they roughly in a line? And are they in proportion to the building and to the door? I've done that before, where somehow I managed to make the second story windows, way bigger than the door, which they are not bigger than the door, but somehow I managed to do that. And sometimes when we're drawing buildings or anything really, we can get really into the detail of what we're drawing and forget to step back and look at the bigger picture and check the scale of everything. So yeah, really important just to take a step back, check that everything feels balanced before you go any further with putting lots of detail in. And then there's kind of a bit of detail there. And then we've got columns at the side. So the door isn't as big as this, where the door's got to fit inside. And then we've got a step. I always find front steps kind of the hardest thing to draw for some reason. Front step, little bits at the end of the column. And then this black bit kind of goes across. And we've got a little windowsill there, and then very roughly doing the roof. And I didn't put it in the original, but it'd be quite nice to have like a, maybe it would have a chimney or something. And when you're sketching, it's just a case of getting everything balanced and checking that yeah, everything is in the right place, it's in proportion, that you haven't run out of space. You know, maybe you've done all these windows really, really detailed, and then you get to the top and there's no room for the top window and you're having to squeeze it in. So this is why it's good just to take a step back and check before you go too far with details, just at this stage where it's just very kind of basic rectangles, and you can always neaten it up as you go along. So this is a house kind of straight on, but we're not always going to be drawing a building straight on. Sometimes we're dealing with perspective. So if we were dealing with painting maybe a street in perspective, which we had an image a bit like that for our drawing challenge last month, you'd have a kind of single point for your perspective, and all your lines are going to be kind of going towards that point, getting smaller into the distance. Pretend the point's there. So the thing to remember with perspective is all of your horizontal lines are all going to be following these perspective lines, and all of your vertical lines are going to stay vertical. They are not going to be leaning side to side, and that's a big mistake that people make. So if I'm doing houses kind of on a street here, I want all the vertical lines to be vertical and upright and, you know, parallel to the edge of the paper really, and they're going to get smaller as they go away. And then we can follow these lines. So maybe we've got the roofs here, maybe chimneys, maybe this is the pavement here. And then if we put another line in for the doors, the vertical lines are always going to be vertical, and then the top of the door is going to follow that line. And you can see as we go along, those little doors are going to get smaller and smaller following the guidelines, and we just need to keep trying to make these lines vertical so we're not kind of leaning to the side. And the same, we could put some more guidelines in for windows. And again, trying to make them even, so this one's quite thin, this one's quite wide. I'm going to make this one a bit narrower so they balance. It's less important as we get further away and they're smaller, but at this point it's good to make them balanced. So just using all these guidelines to help with the perspective, and we can always erase them afterwards. We could use a light box so we don't have all these messy pencil lines underneath. Just put some detailing on the roof. Maybe we've got and then chimney stacks are going to get smaller as we go further away. And these windows are going to get smaller and narrower. Always just checking that everything kind of looks in proportion and looks right. As we go down here, put maybe there's a wider window on this side. But you can see there how putting the perspective lines in the middle, putting perspective lines in to start with really helps us draw this kind of street receding into the distance, kind of a row of terraced houses. And if I hadn't put all these lines in, this would just be a kind of wibbly wobbly mess of wonky lines, so it is really helpful to do that. Another way of drawing a building in perspective, so rather than a whole row going into perspective with a single perspective point, is to have two perspective points, so seeing a building on a corner. So I've got the centre line here, which is going to be the corner of the building, and then I've put in some perspective lines going back to a point on each side. So we're using 2 points of perspective on this one rather than one that we had on the street before. So I've just got these lines very lightly. We've got the top and bottom of the building, and then one right through the middle, and then some other ones that are going to be useful for windows and doors and that kind of thing. So now that I've got that, it's really easy to just start putting the lines in, and you just put in a few vertical lines, and before you know it, it starts to look like a building. So we can think about where we want to put the vertical line, whether it's a really long building, whether it's a shorter building. I'm going to put it in here. And always making sure that that vertical line is roughly parallel to the edge of the page, so it's not kind of leaning that way or that way, you know. It's not kind of going like that or like that. It should be nice and straight and upright. And then another line here. And then we can start putting windows in. So maybe, and again, just making sure these lines are upright. And these lines really help because kind of along the bottom here is the centre line. So all of these windowsills at the bottom are kind of in line with each other, but the ones at the top are at a sort of at an angle. So having these guidelines really helps get that right, and those windows then just look right. Same with this side. And then maybe we've got a door or something here. And again, just making sure these lines are nice and upright, because otherwise it will start to look a bit odd. And I don't know what kind of building this is. It kind of looks a bit like a pub now. Maybe another window here. So yeah, that's how I would do a building from with 2 points of perspective, so looking at it from the corner. So generally it is these horizontal lines that are following the perspective lines, and then our vertical lines are staying nice and vertical and upright. But there are situations where it will be the vertical lines that are following the perspective lines and the horizontal lines that are going to be staying parallel with each other. So for example, if we draw a skyscraper and we're standing at the bottom, through a point at the top for my first perspective line, and I'm just going to put in a few like that. And we're standing at the bottom of the skyscraper and looking up to the top, so then how tall we want it to be depends where we put the line. Maybe here, so that's pretty tall. So that horizontal line parallel to the top of the page, and then we're going to need another horizontal line here, and then following these lines you could then start putting in some little windows. And then these would get bigger as you go down, and I'm just kind of watching, making sure that I keep all of these lines nice and horizontal and parallel, that they don't start going wonky. So just putting in some guidelines like that would help. And we could follow down with guidelines like this as well, just to make sure that all of these windows are in proportion with the scale and with each other. There we go, you kind of get the idea. So then we would have perspective looking up at a building, but I wouldn't really use that in my work. I'm much more likely to be doing something that looks like this or like this. So now we've looked at the basics of sketching and perspective, we are going to look at painting buildings. And I thought this was a nice sketchbook spread to start off with, because it's all buildings and it's two different approaches, and it shows how we can capture buildings by simplifying and stylizing them, and how much we simplify and stylize them will depend on the scale and the whole scene. So these buildings are both in Ile de Ré, which is a little island off the coast of France. Very, very beautiful place. And they've both got these lovely blue shutters. So with this one, it's the building takes up the full page. So I've got quite a lot of detail in, and I've really looked quite accurately at the detail on the shutters. So I've put that in, I think, with pencil. So we've got all the detail on the shutters, the kind of what surrounds them, and I've used the colour of the page, and I've really kind of brought out this blue colour palette, so it's very monochromatic. These ones, we've got a completely different scale. The buildings are much, much smaller, so instead of drawing the shutters and then putting in all the details with pencil or with a small brush, each shutter is just one little brush stroke. So there's two blue brush strokes, a little darker brush stroke in the middle, and then a horizontal brush stroke over the top. And it's really simple, but those are the shutters, and we know they're shutters and we understand that they're shutters, and trying to do this level of detail on this scale just wouldn't be possible. And even if it was, I think it would look a bit out of place or would be slightly distracting. So this kind of level of detail really works. And I find scenes like this, busy scenes with buildings, interesting perspectives, quite intimidating. And for me, to simplify things down and let my brush lead the way really helped. And when I say let my brush lead the way, I mean I didn't do a lot of pencil lines and pencil drawings. I just kind of put details in with the paintbrush and saw what looked right. So I've got these little individual brush strokes for the shutters and the windows and the lintels. I've put shadow in, so there's some line work but not a lot. The shadows really help give the perspective on the buildings, or help differentiate one building from the other by having different kind of subtle shades. And then the roofs, I found a really good technique for painting these lovely red roofs, and that is to use an angled shader brush. So something a bit like this, and then you can see how that is just absolutely perfect. You just pull it like that, and then you get a nice neat line there. And I think with the brush strokes, I think I've probably pulled it across this way. So you can see I've just gone across and then straight down, and I've really used the negative space here. So I've used the white of the page and just putting the roof in and a bit of shadow and some shutters, and then you get the sense of it being a building. You know, you don't need huge amounts because we all know what a building looks like, so there's something lovely about putting just enough in and not getting too bogged down with details. My approach to painting buildings is very much my approach to painting anything, which is it's about creating an atmosphere and reflecting how it feels to you, how it looks to you, and capturing personality. Even in buildings, I think they've got a character, they've got a personality, the place will have a personality. For me, it's not about total accuracy. You know, these are not architectural renderings. So to me, this is quite simplified, but it really captures the feel of being in this beautiful little town by the sea. And I think we're looking down from like a church tower or something, where I took the reference photo for this. So yeah, let go of perfectionism and total accuracy and focus on capturing atmosphere and personality. So we're going to have a go doing some different brush strokes, and I'm going to talk about different brushes that I use and different brush strokes that are useful for capturing buildings. So here we've got a few different brushes that I find useful for painting buildings. So we've got round brushes. I've got a size 4 and a size 2. So this is a great, really versatile all-rounder, the size 4, and then the 2 is nice for any kind of line work. And then we've got this one, which is a flat square brush, so obviously very useful for straight lines and filling in big areas, and then an angled shader as well. And if you've got your paints and brushes, you could have a go at painting along with me and just practicing some brush strokes, which is a nice way to kind of build up to practicing architectural details. So a great thing to practice with your round brush is to practice painting kind of little rectangles, and these could be shutters, windows, doors, anything from a kind of small scale. So I hold the brush on the side like this, drag it down and lift up, and you get a nice kind of soft rectangle shape. Very different to if I was pulling the brush down like that. It's just a little bit more oval and rounded. But having it on the side like this, and I can press harder and then get more of a little rectangle shape. So it's a good idea just to give that a bit of a practice. You could do it just with a single brush stroke or 2 brush strokes, and just practice doing some little lines like that, holding your brush on the side. And then we could practice doing some little shutters like on the houses we just saw. The shutters in a bit closer. So it's a good idea just to practice with your round brush, getting these kind of little square or rectangle brush strokes and just doing nice, straight, long lines for getting a nice straight edge on buildings. And then you can start kind of filling it in and using the negative space to create little windows. And obviously a square brush is really good for this, for doing very nice straight lines, especially if you want all your lines nice and even. Square brushes are great for that, and then you can kind of fill in like that, and you've got little windows there. And then the angled brush, also great for straight lines, but great for angles, as you would expect with an angled brush. So I'll just show you how I did those little roofs. So you can just pull it up in a nice straight line, you get a lovely angle. You can go across and then down, and you can build up a little house so simply without needing to outline it. And obviously line work is really popular for houses for obvious and buildings for obvious reasons. There's a lot of straight lines, but I always think it's nice when you can avoid black outlines. So we've got the little roof there, and then I'm going to put a bit of shadow in. Always using chromatic greys for shadows because they're just softer, and especially with buildings there's so much grey and beige and stone in buildings, so if you mix up a chromatic grey out of the three primary colours and white, you'll get something that's lovely and soft, subtle and multi-tonal and nuanced, rather than something that's kind of a flat heavy brown out of a tube. So we've got a bit of shadow on that side. We could put a little door in. So just thinking of the angle, it's probably going to be something like that. This is a very cute little cottage. And then another great device is to use negative space. So with an image like this, instead of outlining the bottom of the house, I could just sort of paint what's around it. So maybe it's got some kind of greenery. And obviously that's very, very simple, but you can see how we've very quickly built up this little house out of brushstrokes using an angled brush, putting in some shadow, using negative space, and then very simply putting in a door and window. And negative space is a really great device to use, especially if you're painting a white building. Putting the sky in behind it is a great way of painting it, and it can look really dramatic. So if we imagine we're painting a building somewhere kind of sun-drenched, you kind of imagine the building is there. I get these lines reasonably straight, and then I'm just going to put in some sky, giving a bit of space for clouds. Very loosely putting in the sky, and then putting in some shadow on one side, which immediately gives the building a bit of dimension. And then thinking about how we could put in some little windows. So I'm going to go with a chromatic grey, but keeping it kind of bluey, I think. So I've got a kind of a light bluey grey that I'm going to use for putting in some windows on this side. I tend to do things in little batches, so instead of doing one window, then the second window, then the third window, I'll do all the little lines down, all the little lines across. Find for me it helps me keep them more even and consistent. And then I've got the slightly darker mix that I'm going to use for the windows on this side, which I think this is probably still a tiny bit too wet, but I'm just trying to keep these in line and obviously following the perspective lines. A little bit of roof on the top, and then I can imagine that being a block of flats kind of in a sunny country now. You can just imagine putting a little palm tree in next to it or something. And then with the windows, I think on this scale just leaving them blank works, but you could also put a little bit of colour in and just do a light wash. I never like putting pure black in windows. I think it's too heavy and dark, and it really draws your eye to it, and I don't think you necessarily want your eye drawn to what's inside the windows. So something like a light wash of chromatic grey, a muted colour. Let's see, try putting a little bit of colour in. I feel like I liked it better before, but we'll see how it looks when it's dry. So drawing a window with more detail, more close up. So what I used to do, let's say there's the woodwork on the window is white. I always struggled with this a bit, and I probably would have used a very fine brush and sort of outlined it in lots of detail. So maybe we've got the bit kind of coming across. Kind of all the window details here. And then filled in the window panes with whatever colour they're going to be inside. Which is quite a nice technique. You can do it quite loosely, or you can go kind of right up to the edge like that. Another way of doing windows would be to put the inside of the windows in and use negative space for the frames. So just kind of roughly putting in the window like that, and then maybe it's got a bit of a ledge, maybe there's a bit of a kind of alcovey thing here, I'm not sure what you'd call that. And then we've got the colour of the wall around it. And maybe there's a few bricks, maybe it's got some little pot plants on the window. I don't know if you can hear that, it's raining very heavily outside of my little garden studio. Just kind of putting in a little bit of personality. Bit of shadow around there. And kind of the odd bricks. If I give this one the same treatment, so I'm going to put the colour in around it. But we've got kind of two very different styles here. I feel like I lean slightly more towards this one. Maybe it's the slightly more sophisticated one, but two different ways of doing them. And I think the key thing with the windows and with the outlines is not going for a stark black or a grey. So I've used, I've kind of mixed a chromatic grey and then mixed in a bit of the primary blue, which gives a lovely kind of sky blue look to it, which looks quite nice. And you can think about playing with colour with your windows. So if it's a bright sunny day, maybe they're reflecting the sky. If it's in the evening, maybe it's warm and glowy inside. So you can see I did that technique in my process video last month when I was doing a kind of Christmassy scene. So I had these kind of warm peachy tones coming from inside because I wanted it to feel warm and glowy. And another way of doing windows is to do those little dashes, which works really well on things like skyscrapers and big buildings. So I've prepared some little swatches earlier. Makes me feel very Blue Peter. I don't know if anyone's going to get that reference. But I'm just going to mix up a grey, so just kind of a shade darker than what's already here. And then just really simply doing little dashes on here. Just turns that into a little skyscraper. And you can do little single dashes, or if you can be bothered, you can do little lines, which can look quite nice. And it all really depends on the scale of the buildings, how much detail you're going to put in. So I wanted to look at painting windows where you've got a solid colour. So what I've done previously is I've kind of left space for the windows, but with maybe if you've already got a colour here, we could use a kind of semi-transparent shadowy colour, and that would work quite well for creating the windows and creating some shadow. So using this kind of semi-transparent bluey shade for putting in the windows, and then might use that as well for putting some details in, putting in some bricks. The other thing that's great actually with practicing your brush strokes, controlling your brush, is for doing things like bricks as well. So these kind of little brush strokes like this. You know, great for doing little individual windows or doors, but if you turn it the other way, great for doing bricks. So it's nice to kind of practice that. And you can have a kind of that brick pattern or just have the odd brick here and there, but turning your brush on the side like that is a great way of painting these kind of little rectangles, or lovely for things like a shingle roof or cobbles like that. And you can play with that and make them, they're quite even there, but I could make them more uneven for a kind of a more higgledy-piggledy rustic roof or cobbles, for example, and vary the colour as I'm going along. So that's quite a nice effect. So you could just play around with kind of creating a sort of a tile effect like that, which is really useful for painting all sorts of old buildings and walls and that kind of thing. And I've got a couple of pink squares here. So putting white lines on, you can do it with white paint. I never think it looks terribly successful. I'm going to go doing one with white lines and one with a kind of a coloured lines for the windowsills and just see what works. So with the white lines, I feel like they really need a little bit of an outline so they stand out. So I've got the same shade but darker, and that's a great way of putting detail in with buildings without using black lines, is just to use the same shade but darker. It's great for doing all sorts of architectural details and shadows. Just thinking about where I'd put the shadows, so not outlining everywhere, just thinking, okay, let's put shadows underneath and then on this side. And then just putting in some little bricks. And then just with that pop of shadow, it now looks a little bit more like a window. It looks quite cute. And obviously this is more subtle, but might be quite nice for an older building like a cottage, and this is quite fun. But I think with both of them going in with the pink for the bricks and the shadows has really brought them alive. And one thing that's good to bear in mind with windows is if we're not looking straight on, if we're looking at a building from a little bit of an angle, we've got some perspective going on, is you might not see all of the window and you might see quite a deep recess. So sometimes, you know, your brain thinks, I'm painting a window, I need to see the entirety of the window pane or the glass, but sometimes you're not actually going to see all of that, so you can just put in more of a kind of shadow. So maybe a big deep shadow on this side. And then thinking we're seeing kind of shadows from this side, so maybe then shadow here on the edge of the sill. And we'd see the window frame on this side, but not so much on that side. If we kind of saw a window at this angle, we might have quite a big shadow of the windowsill this side, and then we wouldn't necessarily see all of the window for this side. Something that I got asked about is drawing steps. Steps can be really tricky. For me, the simplest way is just to do nice broad brush strokes, nothing too complicated, avoiding line work as always, and making them kind of get smaller as they come towards you. So if I was doing steps, I would do the kind of the bit that's sort of facing you, so not the top of the step, the kind of the bit that is sort of vertical. So I'm just going to do that, kind of getting wider as they come down, and then maybe I'm going to put some architectural details in here. And then putting in some detail for the bit that you tread on. And then putting some shadows in here. But yeah, that's how I would paint steps, very, very simply, very quick and easy. And the other thing to remember with painting buildings is that mixed media is great. So I've done everything with a paintbrush so far, but going in with a pencil is a great way of adding detail. So on this tiny little house here, for example, I could just very simply do some lines, just using a pencil that's a little bit darker than the roof, and then straight away it's roof tiles. If I wanted to on the door, you know, I could do some details or just pop a little bit of shadow in, and these tiny details, like a little bit of shadow, can just sort of transform something, and then suddenly it looks like a window. Or with something like these, you could put some little bit of detail in and then suddenly they feel like windows. And then when it comes to painting buildings with personality, for me it comes down to two things. One, it's little human touches, so it's having things like flower pots on the windowsills, bikes parked outside, laundry hanging outside. All of that just gives a building so much personality, and you know that people live there. And the other thing is not worrying about being too perfect, letting your brush marks be expressive, letting your lines be a little bit wobbly. I'll show some examples on screen. Yeah, that just make these buildings feel like they have a personality. I mean, I guess if you are drawing a big skyscraper, maybe the personality is that it's super sleek and it's, oh my goodness, there's hail outside. I don't know if you can hear that. Yeah, so maybe the feeling of, you know, a big skyscraper is that it does feel kind of super sleek and, you know, shiny glass and chrome, and you would want super straight lines. But, you know, if you're drawing a very old building, having lines that have a little bit of softness to them, that aren't perfectly straight, can be quite nice. It gives your building a bit more personality. So yeah, those are my top tips for buildings with personality. Add human touches and allow your lines to be a little bit organic and soft. And then next up, I'm going to show you a really nice technique that I've developed that needs a light box. So I'm going to show you that technique now. So I just want to show you this technique quickly. It's a really nice technique, but tiny bit tricky, but hopefully when I do it, it'll make sense to you. So I developed this technique when I painted this piece, which I'm going to put up on screen now, which is a kind of Halloween in Brooklyn kind of piece. I wanted to do lovely trees with autumnal leaves, and then have the people really small in scale and really kind of celebrate the trees and the building and create lots of atmosphere. So I loved that piece and I wanted to do another version of it for springtime. So I've already done the trees and I've got the sketch here. So basically I have just printed out the same sketch that I did for the Halloween piece, and I've just taken like the pumpkins out of it. And you can see I've got the branches, but I haven't sketched on the leaves. So I've just painted those with gouache and I'm quite happy with how they're looking. So I'm going to do some of the building and show you how I do it. So light box is absolutely essential for this, and on my sketch you can see there's loads of detail, loads and loads of lines, but what I'm going to do is paint the space in between the lines, and then instead of having lines we're going to have white space, and it's going to give a real softness, because buildings with a lot of architectural detail can feel very heavy and very line heavy. I mean, the detail is beautiful, it's nice to capture it, but I've just found this is a nice way to bring a bit of lightness to it. So I'm just going to mix up a colour for the building. Remember, no pre-mixed browns here, just mixing up my usual way. So a little bit of all the primary colours, lots of white. And I'm pretty happy with that actually, maybe a touch more yellow, but yeah, I'm pretty happy with that, and I want it quite loose and quite watered down, because I want a real softness to this. And then what I'm going to do is just paint the space in between the lines with lovely soft brush strokes. So you want a brush that's not too pointy at the end, and you want a nice kind of fully loaded paintbrush. You don't want the paint to be dry. So there you can see you're starting to get a sense of the building and the window frames with kind of, without doing the lines, you're doing the space in between the lines, which I just think is a really nice technique. And you can see how it works kind of with the detailing on the top up here as well. So again, you can see how we're starting to build up the detail using a lot of white space. So that's all the detailing on the top part of the building now. And I think when you just put a few lines in, it can be hard to tell what's going on. But once it's all there, it really comes together and you do get a kind of a nice sense of the building. So now I just need to do things like the door frames, the lower half of the building, the steps and the people, and hopefully it should all come together nicely. Another top tip, if you're painting a big building like this where there's a lot going on, lots of windows, is do things in batches. So right now I am batch doing all the horizontal lines, and I'm going to do all the horizontal lines first and then I'll do all the vertical lines. It keeps them looking nice and consistent and it just speeds it up a little bit. And now it's time to do all of the vertical lines, and I'm probably going to turn this on the side because I always want to be pulling the brush in a direction that feels comfortable so you get a nice even line. So as you can see, this piece is taking shape. The next top tip I want to share is for doing windows. How do you make them look like glass? Do you leave them white? Do you paint them black? I generally feel like white is too stark and black is also going to draw the eye because it's probably going to be the darkest colour on the piece. So something kind of in between works. It depends on the time of day, so if it's nighttime you probably want to go for something warm and glowy if the lights are on, but as it's the daytime I just want to kind of something that looks like reflective glass that gives us a bit of a hint that there's something inside, but not too much. So I've just mixed up a very, very watery chromatic grey, so just the permanent yellow, flame red and ultramarine with lots and lots of water. So I just want it really, really watery, and then I'm just going to use that colour to fill in the windows. And I feel like the kind of transparent wateriness of this wash gives a nice kind of windowy look, and you've got different tones and colours in there. It's very, very subtle, and you know, if it ends up being too subtle you can always go over it and do another layer very easily. But it's just a nice kind of subtle way of putting in the glass. And with all of this painting, you know, I'm not working right to the edges. I want there to be lots of white space because the white space is kind of creating this line work and keeping it all fresh. Just go around this little person. The hand is giant in comparison to the face, just because I'm working at such a tiny scale. I might have to fix that on Photoshop. But as you can see, this is a really quick and easy way of dealing with the problem of windows. And because it's watery and it's that chromatic grey mix, that some of the blue kind of comes out and settles, and it just does a lot of the work for you. It kind of gives a nice kind of variation of tone, variation of colour, but it's just a very simple watery mix, so it just makes life easier. So I hope this video has given you some tips and tricks for drawing and painting buildings.